I'm so excited to introduce Charles Rothenberger. He's become such an important figure in Connecticut's legislative story. He's doing a tremendous job with Save the Sound. As Save the Sound's in-house climate and energy attorney, Charles focuses on climate policy and legislation to ensure clean air and a robust green economy for Connecticut. With more than 15 years of experience working on environmental energy and energy issues, including a previous stint at Save the Sound, Charles is well versed in lobbying before the Connecticut General Assembly, state agencies, and municipal boards and commissions. He holds a JD from the UConn School of Law and an MA in Public Policy from Trinity College, and has been admitted to the Connecticut, New York, and Massachusetts bar. We're so honored and privileged to have Charles with us today to talk a little bit about policy and legislation here in Connecticut and the 2020 session. Charles, we welcome you. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi. Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
And I need to, all right, a little bit of echo. We'll deal with it. So thank you for that great introduction. I'm delighted to be presenting today on some of the legislative and policy initiatives that are currently being pursued. Actually, I need to figure out this audio. Hold on one second.
That's okay. Take your time. You're fine.
Hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, you sound great.
Okay, sorry about that. I was trying to use my phone, but I'm now using my computer, so this should work a lot better, hopefully. So sorry about that. Just to say that most of what we'll be talking about is prospective or currently in progress before the various state agencies or the legislature, but we'll touch on some additional efforts currently underway that have sprung from earlier legislative directives over the last several years as well. So we can move on to the next slide. This next slide just provides a bit of context for the policy initiatives that some of which you've heard about in the earlier presentations, as well as those being considered. State of Connecticut has long identified investment in clean transportation and renewable energy as important public policies through a number of initiatives, including adoption of the Global Warming Solutions Act, our renewable energy portfolio standards for electricity, and our ongoing participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, capping greenhouse gas emissions from power plants. And just a couple years ago in 2018, we actually updated our Global Warming Solutions Act to establish a new interim goal of 45% greenhouse gas reductions by 2030. It's clear if we're going to meet these goals that transportation has to play a role, and clean electricity is a key part of cleaning up our transportation sector, as Gannon noted during her presentation. As you can see from the circle at the right, the purple section represents the state's greenhouse gas emissions from the transportation sector. That's by far the largest source of emissions in Connecticut currently at roughly 38%. With the building sector combined commercial and residential at 26% and electricity third at 21%. And as you look at the chart on the left, you can see that emissions from the transportation sector have remained relatively flat over the last 30 years, despite increases in vehicle miles traveled. And this is primarily because of improvements in fuel economy. As we all know now, unfortunately, there's currently an effort at the federal level to roll back those fuel economy standards. And I should also note that while emissions have remained flat, they have grown as a percentage of our overall emissions. We'll really have our work cut out for us in terms of increasing transit and other transportation options and accelerating EV deployment if we're going to really significantly reduce emissions from this sector. We can move to the next slide. We've had some discussion around the coronavirus, and the General Assembly has not been immune to the calls for social distancing. The 2020 session was already designed to be a short session with only 13 weeks between the start and adjournment. Currently what will happen with that session is really uncertain. Back in March, an initial 2-day break in business for deep cleaning the building was changed to a 2-week recess, and that has now extended until April 13th. I don't think anyone really knows if the legislature will be back before their constitutionally mandated adjournment date of May 6th, which leaves a lot of the legislation introduced this session essentially in limbo. The good news is that many of the important environmental bills already had their public hearings before the break, and that removes at least one obstacle to their adoption. And certainly the General Assembly has tools that allow it to circumvent the normal legislative process. Bills could be emergency certified by the legislative leadership and set before either the House and the Senate for consideration, even if they haven't been approved by a committee. And while it's entirely probable that any legislative activity that happens before May 6th, if any, will probably focus on the COVID-19 response, the legislature could certainly come back for a special session at any time thereafter to address additional lingering issues. I think I'm just net zero carbon emissions in the electricity sector by 2040. That's important, as we noted, because clean electricity is essential to clean transportation. And it also includes 2 additional provisions, just more specifically focused on transportation. First, it would require DEEP to evaluate California's motor vehicle standards for medium and heavy-duty vehicles. And those standards would help us to meet our federal air quality and state transportation requirements. It authorizes DEEP to adopt those standards by regulation. Given that transportation is the largest source of our emissions, and the state remains out of compliance with the federal ozone standards, those should be using standards to meet. So despite what's happening at the federal level, certainly looking forward to adoption of those standards in a timely fashion. It also authorizes DEEP to solicit up to 300 gigawatt hours of passive, active, and energy storage resources. And looking at electric vehicles as a potential source of energy storage is also part of the overall strategy of the state. So that could have some implications for electric vehicles as well. SB 354, an act establishing a Green New Deal for Connecticut. This is raised by the Labor Committee, and while much of its focus is on ensuring a just transition to a clean energy economy and social justice issues, it does include core substantive climate provisions as well. I won't go into every provision given our focus on transportation, but like SB 10, it would codify the 2040 clean electricity standard and establish zero carbon standards for both the transportation and building sectors by 2050. Perhaps the most critical element of this bill, in my opinion, is require the accountability measures for public actions that it would impose. It would require climate change impact notes for new legislation, and also require agency statements of compliance with Global Warming Solutions Act as part of the regulatory and permitting process. And to many of the points raised by Gannon, these actions would also include land use decisions. So really trying to ensure that we're harmonizing our decision-making with an eye towards our greenhouse gas reduction goals. Some of the more specific bills, raised Bill 5226, and that concerning electric vehicle charging stations. This is really essentially a right to charge law that would prohibit unreasonable restrictions on the installation of an EV charging station for condominium owners. And it also establishes a framework for tenants and renters to negotiate installation of EV charging structure. It's really aimed at larger residential buildings on the rental side, as there are a number of exemptions contained in the bill. For example, it wouldn't apply to residential properties where EV charging stations already exist for tenants in a ratio equal or greater than 10% of designated
where parking isn't provided as part of the rental agreement, or where there are less than 5 parking spaces. House Bill 5228, an act concerning the Commercial Property Assessed Clean Energy Program. If you're not familiar with TACE, as it's called, it's essentially a financing mechanism that ties energy improvements to an ongoing payment system that stays to the property, and where investments are paid back through utility savings. This bill would expand the current definition of energy improvements under the PACE program to include zero-emission vehicle fueling infrastructure, and would also expand the types of projects, or expand these types of projects from the typical savings to investment ratio that's used to guide PACE investments. So giving a little bit of flexibility to roll in EV charging infrastructure into clean energy projects in commercial buildings. 5008, concerning the establishment of high-performance building standards. It's really looking at developing a stretch code for the state of Connecticut. Massachusetts has had a very successful stretch code in place for a number of years, and more than 100 municipalities in that state take advantage of it. This is important for transportation issues because among the various provisions of this high-performance stretch code would require would be standards for the inclusion of EV charging stations. It's something that our advocates have been trying to get included within the standard statewide building code for a couple of years now, and have had limited success, but hopefully with the adoption of a stretch code for voluntary adoption by municipalities, even if we separate there and move forward. And lastly, HB 5260, dealer franchises. This would really just create a task force designed to recommend legislation concerning agreements between manufacturers and dealers. This is basically looking to address the Tesla issue, which has bubbled up into the session over the last couple of years. Next slide. While the legislature might be in limbo, state agencies are continuing to be busy fulfilling earlier legislative requirements and developing policy. As Daphne mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, Connecticut has endorsed an 8-state MOU for zero-emission vehicles. The target in the 8 states is 3.3 million vehicles by 2025. Connecticut's share of that target is between 125,000 and 150,000 vehicles. We're currently at approximately 10,000 registrations in the state, so looking to expand that by more than 10 times in the next 5 years. It's a pretty lofty target, but there are additional policy initiatives moving forward to help support that goal. DEEP's working on finalizing an EV roadmap for Connecticut, and we're hearing that the final version of that is due to be released relatively soon. The roadmap is designed to identify Connecticut-specific policies to optimize deployment of EVs and associated infrastructure, and it will cover a broad range of items, including education, outreach, and marketing efforts, strategies for public and private fleets, opportunities to expand clean transportation options for low and middle income communities, how best to expand our fueling and charging infrastructure, and this came up during one of the earlier presentations, looking at ways to reform the electric utility rate design and demand charges, which currently limit the ability of large fleets to take advantage of charging. I should also note here that as part of Governor Lamont's Lead by Example efforts, last year's budget bill did establish a zero-emission vehicle fleet mandate for the states, so for public fleets, and that would require 50% of cars and light-duty trucks and 30% of buses in the state to be vehicles by 2030. As part of that effort, the Department of Administrative Services is also developing 3-year vehicle procurement plans and working to assess the availability of medium and heavy-duty trucks in the zero-emission vehicle space, and state purchases. The VW settlement funds came up earlier as well. And we've approved $18.3 million worth of funds there.
Just starting with the VW settlement funds, which again, Daphne, you raised. So to date, the state's approved about $18.5 million worth of projects in 2 solicitations. And unfortunately, most of those have been diesel replacement projects rather than electrification projects. So recognizing that trend and wanting to encourage the broader adoption of EVs, DEEP actually reserved about $1.5 million from the last grant round to devote solely to electrification projects. And in addition to that $1.5 million, we also have 15% of the overall funds, or about $8.5 million, dedicated for EV infrastructure projects. So we're still waiting for funding for an electric-specific funding moving forward. And one anticipates, hopefully, that would follow shortly thereafter the release of the EV roadmap. And should also note, while we're talking about funding, last year the General Assembly authorized a $3 million per year incentive funding program to support EV purchases through the state's greenhouse gas registration fee on vehicle registrations. This is the first stable source of funding we've had in the state for EV incentives, so exciting. The incentive levels were reduced last fall in order to stretch the available funding until the end of 2019, but we're hoping that those incentive levels will be restored once the new cheaper board is fully appointed. We're still waiting for a few legislative appointments. Legislators obviously have other things on their mind right now, but hoping within the next month or so that board will be fully impaneled and can take a fresh look at the incentive levels and hopefully restore them. Governor Lamont has also restarted the Governor's Council on Climate Change, and among its charge is to evaluate how the state's doing in fulfilling the recommendations made by the GC3 back in 2018, while also exploring new policy opportunities for transportation-related greenhouse gas reductions. In that 2018 report, the GC3 recommended adopting a goal of increasing EV penetration to at least 20% by 2030. So again, these are numbers that are well beyond where we are now and our current trajectory, but hopefully some of these ancillary policies and the EV roadmap will put us on the right path. I won't spend a lot of time talking about TCI since I think Gannon did a good job covering that. I will just note that as with all of these transportation initiatives, while the greenhouse gas reductions are significant, there are also really important public health co-benefits to these policies as well. And modeling for the TCI has pegged the total monetized health benefits from adopting that policy from anywhere from $3 billion to $10 billion, depending upon the size of that program. And again, that's going to provide up to $8 billion per year in revenue that can be designed specifically to transform our transportation infrastructure. So we're hoping as we move past the coronavirus and we have more bandwidth that in this fall states will start signing on to the MOU for the TCI, and hopefully we can start reaping the benefits of that program just as we have for the last decade in RGGI. And then I'll finally just note, moving from DEEP to PURA, that the Public Utilities Regulatory Authority is really casting a broad net in looking at opportunities to transform the state's electricity grid through its grid modernization dockets, including one focused specifically on zero-emission vehicles. Just this week, they released a request for public comments on proposed RFPs in each of those grid modernization focus areas. And the ZEV RFP is soliciting proposals across 6 identified program areas, including residential level 2 charging at single-family units, residential level 2 charging at multi-unit dwellings, public direct current fast charging or DCFC, public level 2 destination charging, and workplace level 2 charging, and then also development of a low to moderate income customer electrification mobility study. So really looking broadly at how best to deploy EV charging infrastructure to help support some of the lofty goals that the state has set for itself. So you can see between this PURA activity and everything that's happening at the Department of Environmental and Energy Protection, that while the legislature is somewhat dormant, at least on the bill passage front, I'm sure legislators are busy in their home districts dealing with the current health crisis, that there's still plenty of activity happening around electric vehicles in the state, and we're hoping to be able to continue that momentum and grow the state fleet significantly. And I think you can move to the next slide, and I think that that is all that I have.
I think what we'll do, we're not sure if we have any questions for Charles. I'm not seeing any in the chat. That was awesome, Charles. That was a big round of applause for Charles. That was great. Thank you, Charles.
Well,
it's so important the work you're doing.
Thank you. I apologize for the technical difficulties.
No, it was awesome. So fascinating, everything you were talking about. And we will await any questions that come up, and we will certainly make sure that we address you and we get answers to any questions that do come up. So thank you so much. It was awesome.